So I'm Victoria Sparks. I teach percussion.
I'm Elroy Friesen, and I work with the choirs and I teach conducting.
I'm Laura
I'm Jimmy.
Lowen.
Oh, sorry.
I was waiting for that to happen.
Okay, who's going to go next?
You
Laura.
are, Laura.
Okay, so I'm Laura Lowen. I do many things. I am vocal coach. I teach diction. I help all the classical singers figure out how to sing in multiple languages. And I'm also Associate Dean Undergraduate this year.
I'm Jimmy Maiello. I'm the Associate Dean Graduate, and I also teach musicology.
Fabio Agnelli. I teach jazz drum set as well as jazz pedagogy and ensembles.
Awesome. So there you go. So we're talking today about reading scores. We decided that it would be useful for our students to get together and talk about some of the different perspectives that we all bring in our different areas to kind of deciphering this language of reading scores. And so kind of offering some of our tips and tricks and some of the things that maybe help us along our professional work. And maybe some of those things could be useful to you, wonderful students of ours. So maybe we'll start off with Laura, some of the ideas that sparked this idea to have this conversation.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so Jimmy had made a video for students on how to read a textbook, and it's a great video. Have that up for people to watch. But when I was watching it, I was like, this is so much like reading a score and learning how to navigate a score. And all of the pitfalls that you talked about in that video are all of the things that we are also drawn to that feel at first glance like a completely logical way of learning a score, but in the end are real problems that create way too much work, that create an inability to engage in the larger picture. So I talked to Tori and we just set this up, and I'm so excited about this. So I am a collaborative pianist. I do not perform as a soloist very often at all. I perform with singers and instrumentalists in music from hundreds and hundreds of years in lots and lots of different languages. And my work as a diction teacher also is about exploring a bunch of different languages and figuring out, first of all, what are the similarities and the differences between them, and how to actually communicate really profound ideas in languages that you don't speak. And my world is incredibly specific. I mean, if you're playing with another musician and you don't do what's in the score, not only do you not have integrity in your part, but that other person isn't going to do their work. And it often comes down to extraordinarily small details. And especially with languages, not understanding those tiny details of how sounds work together can create a lot of problems. And so I live in this very precise specific world. But if you stay there, if you stay at the note level, which is so easy to do, you're not actually going to be able to do your job, because ultimately what I do is I have relationships with people, and everything that I do with other people and with understanding a score has to be about relationships, or I'm not going to actually have the tools that I need to make music with another person. And it's very easy to go from micro to macro, to think of the tiny details and then try and figure out how they go together. But it's much better, and it's got much more integrity, I think, and much more useful to start from macro, to look at the large structures of relationships. How long are these phrases and these sections? What do I know through the harmony about the architecture of this phrase and where the peaks and valleys are? How does the composer use the musical language at their disposal in ways that are predictable, and then in ways that are unpredictable? And then if I know all that stuff, then all of the notes make sense, and I'm practicing them being fully educated and fully informed about what they're actually doing. If I know that my tendency and my students' tendency and everyone I've ever met is to learn the technical things first. And it's like, I don't have time to actually look at the music because I'm too busy with all these notes. But if we are learning the notes without understanding their context, we are wasting an enormous amount of time because we don't understand the relationship, and we're probably doing work that's not useful. And the fingerings I'm going to choose, the articulations I'm going to choose are going to be wrong, and I'm going to have to unlearn those eventually. So look at the big picture. I often say to my students, read everything except for the notes. And they give me the exact look that you probably have now. But it totally works. When you just say, I'm going to read the crescendos and I'm going to read all of those all of those things and not read the notes, suddenly the notes make more sense.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those markings, what they do is they give us an entryway into relationships and larger pieces of the music. Sight reading is a huge part of my life. And if you sight read with the musical shapes, it's amazing what happens. So that's it for now.
I think that ties pretty quickly to kind of almost the direct opposite of what we were just saying in some of these topics. So maybe Fabio, did that kind of spark some thoughts for you?
Yeah, that was great to hear. I really liked some of those. I like the, read everything but the notes. That's great. Yeah, with jazz, it's the range of how specific a composer is just huge. I work with people who, if anything, they want you to have as much freedom in how you interpret things. And then there's other people who they're so specific that some of them even will write out, let's say, a specific drum part. But with jazz musicians in general, and this is not to say that this doesn't happen in the classical world, I'm just not familiar with it as much, but it's about the library of references in your head, because that's how composers often use music to describe what they're hearing. So they'll bring a piece of music and, we just have the melody and chord changes, and they'll just say, oh, this is this kind of beat, or this is, I want you to think of Billy Higgins on this, or if you can think of a little bit of like a Marcus Gilmore thing, or like a West African thing, like a 12. So it's always references, references, references. And in my experience, I found that the more references I have, the more freedom I have in my interpretations of playing people's charts, because more often than not, people don't write a specific drum part unless there's someone who's really through composing a piece. Actually, a great friend of mine, Michael Davidson, who's a great vibraphonist and marimba player, he takes that extra step and will write out specific drum parts for some pieces. But now, just having recorded recently with John Gordon for some nonet music that he's written, there's these amazing pieces and harmony in the bass lines, and the interpretation, he says, oh man, whatever you have in mind would be great, And so from there, what I usually do is I just play and thank God for rehearsals, because I can have one stab at it, and then I hear something and I say, oh, it would be really cool on this part. And then that's where my influences come in, or a musician's influences would come in, and they can refer to that library of music that's in their subconscious. So unless someone's very specific, when we're playing a 32 bar jazz standard, where then we can reference, recordings of Miles Davis and 2-feel going to a 4-feel, or a Latin feel on the A section, swing on the bridge. When it's original music, you really do need to have this expansive, anything ranging from Stevie Wonder to Stravinsky and everything in between, And so that really helps within how we interpret scores. And one thing that we did in college a bit that I thought was really great was we would follow a whole score for Birth of the Cool, Miles Davis recording. And we would just choose a line, choose the French horn line, and we would just read the French horn line through a couple of tunes. And we did the same with a couple of things in passages in Rite of Spring. And I thought that was absolutely amazing. And as a drummer, it was great, because we're working on, we're reading rhythm in time, and now we're seeing the relationship of pitch, early on. And I think I get excited reading along with certain pieces of music, and it always comes back to those early things like Birth of the Cool and Rite of Spring for me. But yeah, I would say it's about references when it comes to the jazz interpretation of charts and scores.
That's interesting. Elroy, how about you? Is that how do you kind of start tackling a score? You have a different situation in a choral setting.
Yeah, well, we were talking yesterday, and it is true that the difference with choirs is that we need a lot of information in our score, because we don't have definite pitch in our bodies. Most of us. There are a few there are a few perfect pitchers out there, but they actually have a hard time in choir worlds because pitch is relative. It's not exact for us often. And so when you look at a choral score, you are seeing everyone's part. And in fact, if we've done some new music scores for the festival, for New Music Festival, let's say, and if we get a new composition that doesn't have an orchestral reduction for us yet, we're toast. We're useless in the rehearsal, even if we've learned our parts cold. So for us, we see a lot of information in the score. And my challenges in working with choirs and training them is they have to learn to read everyone's part with theirs. So they have to know how their part relates to everything else. And I think, this is when we have instrumentalists who come and join us, let's say, who aren't aware of this, they would like to just start at letter B and go, and it's like, no, we all need to find our pitch. We all need to do this because we get everything we sing comes from something else we've already seen in the score or heard in the score. And we do sometimes try and sing out of part books, but in our contemporary era, we really have no sense. So the score really gives us an incredible amount of information. And then the other thing, as far as ensembles are concerned, when you're comparing an instrumental ensemble versus a vocal ensemble, vocalists and choralists we have text that we sing. And so my job as a conductor is I have to become passionate about the score because I have to be a psychologist and I have to motivate the whole ensemble to be just as excited about that text and then how the composer has set that text. So for me, when I'm sitting down to look at a score, and once I've decided, yeah, this is a valuable score for this choir to do, then I need to find the way in for the choir. And it almost always is through the text. So in some ways, it's like, Laura, I introduce big picture to them first. We get a sense of the music. I definitely learned big picture. I start at the piano and I just sort of sing and play the way, I sight read the way through the score. I don't listen to recordings usually. That comes much later on in the process when I'm doing what Fabio's saying. I'm looking for other people's ideas on things, and there are certain choirs I aspire to interpret like and sound like. But if you take away other people's parts in a choir score, we stop singing. There's nothing we can do. So for us, the score is key, and having a piano reduction in the score for those composition students listening in is really, really, really important for us, because I can't just go and pluck an A out of my vocal folds here.
Maybe someday they'll be able to just inject that.
Exactly.
That's funny. It's interesting to hear how everybody kind of starts in on all of these things. As a percussionist, I seem to always come to everything from a logistic perspective first. And the first thing I do with any new score is just make a list of all the stuff I'm going to need. Because oftentimes there might be a list at the beginning of a few things, but often the composer will realize halfway through a piece that they actually wanted to add 2 or 3 other things, and then they forgot to put them on the list at the beginning, or so you kind of have to actually go through the whole piece and even just make sure you have the right stuff and the right stick to hit the thing, and then figuring out where to put it so that you can reach it when you need to, and kind of get organized that way. So we kind of come at it so much from a more logistic perspective at first, and then kind of deciphering from there what these composers mean with their different notations. Percussion notation is so new in the world that there's no standardization yet. Or there's some simple standardizations, but they are not always adhered to. So oftentimes you kind of have to also figure out, well, what line means what. There's a tradition of not memorizing multi-percussion pieces, because what happens is that the F line in on the treble clef is a symbol, but then the next page side it's a triangle now, and so you have to trying to find what you need and where it is. So kind of deciphering the language of the score is kind of its own. It's like learning a new instrument every time, which is kind of an adventure, and so much fun because we get to hit so much stuff. What about you, Jimmy?
Well, I'm going to change everything I was going to say.
Good.
Because what you're talking about is really very interesting as a group. And so if forgive me if this is a little off the cuff, but the first thing I wanted to comment on was the transferable skill. Let's say you're a music student, you've been reading scores for your entire life. So when you go into a class and you're reading a textbook, this is really not that different. You have all these skills, and it's almost a matter of transferring what you know to look for in information. Um, just like you would look to see how many movements are in a piece, you look at the chapter headings to figure out what's important. Um, as Laura was saying earlier, talking about everything but the notes is really important. Talking about everything but the grammar and the words and the little bitty pieces. Look for those bold-faced words in a textbook. Look for the marginalia. Look for topic sentences. Those are your main ideas. Those are those big crescendos Laura's talking about. That's the gestalt of the piece, and it's also the same thing as the gestalt of a textbook or any kind of reading. The other part of what I wanted to touch on, which is going to get philosophical, and we'll just have to deal with that, is in listening to everybody discuss scores. The thing that was really, really interesting to me is the semiotics. Semiotics is really, it's kind of a branch of linguistics and philosophy, and it's more interdisciplinary, but it's concerned really with the study of signs and sign systems. And in the early 20th century, or late 19th, early 20th century, structural semiotics was the big thing. This was about what we're talking about with structures and looking at a score and really relevant things, especially percussion notation, for example. These are sign systems. And structural semiotics is really good for unpacking what the big meat of your sign systems are in notation. But when Fabio was talking, I'm reminded of that happened in the later 20th century in semiotics towards post-structuralism, which if you know some of Umberto Eco's novels or his writings, was much more interested in the loading that happened with these sign systems too. It wasn't just the notes on the page, or it wasn't just how you realized them in sound. He wrote a major work in the 80s called The Open Work, in which he discussed the idea that every reader was different, and each of these texts, because what we're talking about with scores or a textbook is really a different kind of text, and they have to be interpreted to make sense out of. And so he's, look, everybody's different. You could bring your own experiences into it, and maybe there's an ideal reader, but once the text is out there, you don't control a lot of how it gets interpreted. And so when Fabio was talking about reference and scores, where you have to say, play it more like this, play it more like this person or that person. It struck me as being very close to Eco's idea of the ideal reader, or an open work where there's an infinite number of connections in there. I'm thinking of scores I've played in the past where, you're looking at a trumpet part and it says, play more like Cootie Williams. You have to all of a sudden bring in a whole body of knowledge that is completely separate. Now, that's intended for the ideal reader. The ideal reader knew who Cootie Williams was familiar with his music, and could immediately translate that into sound. And so what it seems to me like we're dealing with is a hierarchy of signs and symbols that has to be processed in literally a nanosecond when you're reading a score. So it's so fascinating to say, like, an outsider would say, well, they're music texts. If even an outsider in linguistics or semiotics would say, well, music is music, sheet music is a text. What we've just seen is that we have four different perspectives on what might be considered the same kind of text that are very, very different. And each subdiscipline brings a different set of skills, or a different set of what we would call reading or interpreting to these texts. Sorry, I know it was philosophical, but that's how I think.
Nothing wrong with getting philosophical on a Friday. I always tell my students I'm philosophical on Fridays, because I I seem to have talked about topics all week long, and by the time I get to Friday, I really have a handle on it. So I'm always a little extra philosophical by Friday. That's excellent. You bring up a lot of interesting ideas, Jimmy. I think it's really useful for us to kind of see the crossovers. And we talk a lot in practicing about transferable skills, but we don't always talk about transferable skills in academics, to our academic sides. I mean, we even talk about life skills a lot, about how how much practicing teaches you how to be a good human. but I think it's great to kind of see even more of the layers of this onion, of how this all works together. I still remember, like, the first time learning a Bach piece and realizing I was learning about Bach in my history class, and realizing that context made a difference. So that's pretty great. I think the jazz area is really interesting that you guys, because I think similar to percussion, that everything is so contemporary that all of those sources are actually audible sources. You can actually go back and hear most of the things that somebody is talking about, and hear what it might have sounded like. Can you imagine if we could have compared, the 760s style to the 1770s style, and really heard the difference in those decades? Like, oh, I can totally tell this recording is from the 1740s. It'd be a really interesting reference to have.
I was gonna say this last year, I had heard this Ligeti piece, this Georgi Ligeti piece, solo piano piece, Desordre, which I think is the first solo piano etude. And I was just kind of, I forgot who brought it to my attention, but there's certain rhythmic qualities of the piece where every 4 bars, an eighth note is lobbed off of one of the hands, and then eventually it gets to the middle. There's a cloud of sound, and then it works the other way where an eighth note is lobbed off the left hand every 4 bars, and so on and so forth. And so I thought, okay, I should actually try to adapt this to the drum set. And so I chose one of the opening chunks of the piece and played along to it, and had to now go from, we were talking about how specific, rather than seeing either a standard or an original piece of music that says 12/8 feel, which also is a whole bag to unpack there when people put everything under the Latin envelope in jazz. That's a whole other talk, but and now I'm getting to this very specific score, and it was pretty at first it was a little overwhelming, because if you know the piece, you look at the score and it's just ink, and unpacking that in a creative way, like trying to get creative in how I'm going to unpack that and apply to the drums and be as free as I can be while being as specific as possible was a really great challenge. And I think of the freedom within the boundaries, and I think there's the great guitarist Jim Hall. He talks about jazz being freedom within the boundaries. So tennis, if we remove the lines, the game is completely pointless, and it's about how creative you could be within those lines. And so it was a really great experience for me to find something that is so specific, like this solo piano piece where the rhythms are very clear, and now not only use them and play them very specifically, but play as free as I can over, interpret different ways. Can I embellish the time, stretch, pull, push the time, while still keeping these rhythms really intact? And that was my first delve into that kind of thing, and I thought it was amazing. And it's something that I've experimented the last couple of years with, trying to learn a speech, like an actual interview, an interview with Keith Jarrett or something, and try to apply the speech and the shape and the pacing of speech to the drums, because there it's all feel. It's about the inflection, articulation. I can't rely on counting, anymore, or feeling time. It's about breathing. And so that's kind of helped with this interpretation of music in a way. How specific can I get, and how free can I be within being specific? Sorry, Jimmy.
One of the things that I think is implicit in what you're saying when you're talking about transferring a Ligeti piece like that to a drum set, implicitly there's a processing of a hierarchy of information. If you know that Ligeti takes a textural approach to things, you have to kind of triage that information when you look at the score and figure out what the most important stuff is. And that leads me to a question, I think, if I can put everybody else on the spot to ask: when you do look at a score, because this is a sign system, what's the hierarchy in there? What do you go to first, and what's the most important things? And I'm curious if you could each go around and say, in your own subfield, what's the most important thing that you look for in a score immediately to make sense out of it?
Go for it, Laura.
First of all, what a great conversation. So interesting. And I'm just like, my head is just a buzz thinking of, we should do some playing together now, all of us, and figure this out. So anyways, that can be our next one. It really depends. I mean, ultimately, I feel like my responsibility in a piece is towards the phrases, is to understanding the musical language. And I think that that's the most important thing. I have to have the same relationship to every piece. My job is to kind of learn how to speak this language. The composer is going to take me in completely different places, but that's the job of the language. My job is to enter into it with an open mind, I feel like without an agenda, without an idea of what things are supposed to be, but rather letting the materials show me what is important. And I find that works really well. And it thinking about music that way has made me a much more flexible musician, because I'm actually learning to speak a language from somebody who understands it, rather than bringing my my predispositions of what I think a Spanish song should be, or a German song, or a French song. So it doesn't really answer the question, but it gives me an in into it.
That's all right. Elroy.
I think for my thinking is being sparked by both Jimmy and Fabio. The idea, Jimmy, you asked where do I go first? And I think I'm often going to context. I want to know about the poet and their life, and what was happening in their life while they were writing that poetry, because I need to find the emotional way into the text. And then I also want to know about the composer. And so I want context. I want historical context, like crazy. I want to know if the composer was overweight or not. Like, I want to know that Handel loved his beer. And I also want to know that he was German, but trying to speak. I can only imagine what his English accent or his German accent was like when he was composing in England. And so then when I'm going to apply Germanisms to the way we do the English text when we're singing as a choir, for example. So I want to know as much as I can about the context, so that when I'm making musical decisions, I have the freedom to be that person, like a Baroque conductor. I can make decisions. So the big picture first, Jimmy. And then for Fabio, just that whole idea of boundaries. I think that's what I'm doing, because I look at you look at Mendelssohn's Elijah, and the score is like this thick, and it's just hundreds of pages long. And what do? You can't go to details. Like Laura said, you have to first know the big picture. And I need to know context of everything. And I need to know historically what's going on in the world around that person, in the musical language of the time. And then once I have all those boundaries in place, then I can be this creative, free person in the middle. And that's when we can talk about, we can also then make the connection for the modern audience and for the modern singer. So if we just look at it, like if we read it as a modern person looking literally at maybe the text that was chosen to be written by a poet, it might sound something that would not fit today, but why was it written that way? So it is very much, for me, it's really, really big picture. And then with Elijah, I had to cut an hour of music. Once I have the big picture and the big story, then I go, okay, what can I take away that keeps the through line and keeps the musical foundation and structure there? So I didn't know this before. I couldn't articulate it before you guys were speaking, but now boundaries and the big picture, it really is where it's at for me.
Awesome.
Before Tori weighs in, can I just draw on something that you just brought up, Elroy? When you're talking about something like Elijah and the big picture, again, I don't want to read too much into what you're saying, but if I can translate a little bit into some more concrete things, part of what you're saying is it's an oratorio from the 19th century. You need to know what an oratorio from the 19th century is, because then you don't have to waste time learning all the little details, because you know about 90% of that model right now. You know it's going to be arias, choruses, basically a tonal language with some chromaticism, and you're ready for this because you already have brought it into a space that it's like something else or a pattern and that's I understand, like you're saying it implicitly, but I think especially if I were a student, I'd need to hear that.
Well, and also, like, I'm just thinking, we're learning Pergolesi's Stabat Mater right now, which is not technically for choir, but it's this late Baroque piece, and we know that one of the things in art in Baroque music is that, or in art in Baroque era, is the artists are always trying to find the heightened emotional state. Well, if we see these people in ecstasy and agony, and their bodies are writhing and they're frozen in the sculpture in just the most highly emotive state, then when we're singing about the Virgin Mary's or the Mother Mary's tears as her son is crucified on the cross, we are looking to use Baroque musical language to heighten the emotional tension as much as possible. So we stay true to Baroque, but then we also think, and what can we do staying true to Baroque that will also speak to our audience so that they are brought along on that emotional journey? In my case, I tend to go towards more emotional consonants, even if it's in Latin, because I know that we're English speakers here and we relate to consonants, for example. So anyways, yeah, I all of that extra stuff and that whole library of knowledge that I need to have, and I need to have stories about composers and all that. I'm drawing on all of that to create my boundaries so that I have freedom to work.
Wonderful. Laura.
I just want to say the performance of Elijah was extraordinary, and to see the journey that I think you took the students on allowed them all to feel entry into that piece and passionate about it and passionate about telling those stories. And I was coaching somebody this morning, and she's singing a song where she has the word Herz on a very high note, and it's really hard to sing an H on a high note. And Elroy had used this technique where you use a slightly different sound for an H, and they were all over it. Like the performance was just so spectacular. Every single H was this sound. And so I was talking to the student. I was like, "You were in Elijah, right? You know what Elroy did with that. So try that sound at this particular difficult note in your song." And it just worked so well. And it worked because it's a good idea, but also because she had this experience, this amazing experience that is really embedded into her body. And I think one of the great things that we do that we can do at a university is what they're learning in any class is going to inform them in another class. And we don't have to be, I think of the responsibility I would have if I was like a freelance teacher and I was the only person talking about music with a student. And I'd have to know everything, but I don't. I just have to know what I know and trust that they're learning things from everybody else. And together we're creating this amazing three-dimensional support and education, and it worked so beautifully today. And that you talked about Elijah just reminded me of it. So that's it.
That's wonderful. I'm going to change gears a little bit because I'm still thinking of Jimmy's original question, which is what is the first thing you do when you look at a score? and and the first thing that came to my head is the line I use all the time, which is rhythm and contour. Can you read the rhythm and can you play the shape? And it's an exercise I do at clinics all the time because it always gets a good laugh. But if you play the notes of Happy Birthday in the wrong rhythm, no one will recognize the tune. But if you mash the rhythm on a piano with your hands just with the right intervallic kind of jumps and whatever, but just as many notes as you can hit, nobody will miss it ever. Everybody will know that is Happy Birthday. And so when you're sight reading, when you're getting into something new, if you can see the rhythmic and contour shape of it, you're going to get the ideas going of what those phrases are, of what those shapes are, even if you're only playing 15% of the notes right. And then that'll start kind of giving you a framework and a structure to start plunking those correct notes in as you keep working through those interpretive ideas. Every time you run through and do a better job of the crescendo, you also got another run at the notes. And so that very kind of taking a musical thing to get at a practical thing is something I really love.
There are two things here that I'm running through everybody's responses that I want to pull together. One is the combination, to me at least, that everybody is saying that we need to use both structural and contextual post-structural approaches in reading the scores. Tori's talking about contour and rhythm, which is a more structural feature. Fabio and Elroy are talking about much more about context and bringing in external information to make to amplify your understanding of a score. But the interesting thing for me is that we're not doing one or the other. We have a responsibility to do both at the same time, which brings me to my second point that everybody has either said explicitly or implicitly, which is you need to know your field up, down, and sideways. You need to read everything you can, listen to everything you can, play through stuff. I don't even want to say for fun, but play through things when you get a chance, just to get a sense of things, even if you're never going to perform them, because this is your language and this is your world. And the faster you can draw on all that, that's how you're reading scores efficiently and fast and making real music out of it.
And as a student, I think probably the best thing there is to take advantage of your resources, because that can be a daunting task to think every little piece that I'm playing, I have to do all of this research. This is a lot. But with with your teachers, with your colleagues in your classes, with your different, in all these different kind of connections. And we're struggling right now to figure out how to make these connections digitally, but we are figuring out ways to do it. To kind of not only learn that's an internal pressure that you have to put on yourself, but also to learn to make use of the resources around you in order to build that language and vocabulary for yourself. I love that this conversation is kind of steering towards interpretation, and I think that's such an important part of score reading, the right of performers to and the responsibility to interpret, to delve into all this, that it is our right and it is our responsibility as performers to get into all of this, and it's so much fun. Laura, and then Fabio.
Super fast. One thing that I really think is important is this is a lifetime journey. Like, the way I understand scores now is radically different than it was 10 years ago. And I hope it is also much less than I'm going to understand in 10 years. And so the skills that you're developing as a student feel daunting and overwhelming, but you're setting a foundation for the rest of your life. And if you play a piece now, you're going to understand it at a certain level, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be an amazing experience for you and for your audiences. 10 years from now, you're going to understand it in a completely different way. But that doesn't mean that what you're doing now is not great.
Mm-hmm.
And so we also have to be extraordinarily patient, because this is a huge job that we are doing to make music that is not from our culture and time. We are delving into so many things. So just know that you've got the rest of your life to keep learning. And like Pablo Casals said, when he was in his 90s and someone asked him, why are you still practicing? Well, I'm just starting to figure this out. And I mean, I totally paraphrase that. That was not correct, but it's hopefully the right spirit.
That's
but
excellent.
I hope that for myself, and I hope that for all of us, that we know that we got a lot of years to figure this out.
Yeah.
You have to fall in love with the score before you start working on it.
I would say my one hot tip is not to be afraid of the scores and to bring in everything you know, even if it seems like it's not relevant. Think about everything and how you can apply everything you know to that task.
Treat learning a score and practicing as an experiment. Don't be scared of making mistakes. They're a huge part of the learning experience. And because you make a mistake once does not mean that you are doomed to make it for the rest of your life, which is certainly what I felt when I was a student. Make mistakes, get messy, make big choices. We are all so musical. We will know if we make horrible choices and if it doesn't make sense with the score.
I think both being patient and open-minded when you're approaching a score for the first time, just being ready to, I think, just kind of tying in what everyone's saying, is just taking it all in, trying to, learn more about the composer, learn more about the air, like just everything, just to really inform you. And yes, and definitely not be afraid of making mistakes. That's a great point, Laura, for sure. Definitely important.
Awesome. And my philosophy is always one of Mary Poppins, which is well begun is half done. Don't wait, just start. Don't wait till you think you're ready. Don't wait till you think you know enough. Don't whatever, just start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start.
Oh, you guys, thank you. This was so wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
a great conversation.
This for me is I really like this when there's direction. Like I just feel so energized.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's direction, and I also realize how smart my colleagues are, how brilliant you guys are,
Absolutely.
how intelligent you are. I just love that.
Yeah.
To be fair, we don't get out much, so.
Well,
Feeling is